Just a little bit of an explanation in that my position I actually is non-dualist technically, in the sense that I believe that the human mind has a duality to it, two elements. But in terms of my overall viewpoint of how the universe functions, I believe that everything is one essence, as it were, that mind and body and mind and spirit are actually elements of the same thing at a deeper level of reality. And in fact, that brings us very neatly into the idea of the concept of the holographic universe. Now, what we're really talking about when we talk about the nature of the holographic universe is the idea that the way in which the mind functions and the way in which the mind functions and interfaces with external reality is an ongoing mystery to modern science. In other words, it's called a hard problem. It's the idea of how inanimate matter can bring about thought and intelligence and self-reflection. In other words, every single person that's listening to this discussion at the moment out there knows they have an inner life, they have an inner narrative, they have a history, they have anticipations, they have hopes, they have fears, they have loves, and they have hates. But none of these things exist in three-dimensional reality. None of these things can be measured or quantified by materialist reductionist science. So in other words, consciousness itself is a mystery, in that however hard you try to think about it, the idea that inanimate matter, which becomes organic matter, but is still non-thinking, can bring about sensations, thoughts and feelings. And indeed, an Australian philosopher by the name of David Chalmers has actually called this the hard problem, because it is an ongoing mystery. But if we realize that both thought and mind and brain and everything else are all manifestations of a deeper reality, then it suddenly makes sense. What I was suggesting you just reflect on a second to think, everything you're seeing and everything you're hearing and everything you're perceiving is being processed by your brain. In other words, light is hitting your eye, or electromagnetic radiation is hitting your eye, which is then being converted into electrical impulse that travels along your nerves, along your neurons, into your brain and into the part of your brain that processes sight. It is then and only then that it reconverts the electrical impulses into what we can only term an image. Now, the image that is originally created, the original image is a very small postage-sized area of light on your retina, which is inverted and warped. And yet your brain creates this three-dimensional reality that you can see or you think you see through your eyes. But of course, that's not the external reality. We've no real knowledge of exactly what that external reality is. The brain inwardly creates everything we perceive. So therefore, it is logical to conclude that the brain adds things to what we see. For instance, it is probably a little-known fact that at the back of each eye, there is something called the optic chiasma. It's the blind spot, and it's where the optic nerve leaves the back of the eye. Now, if you close one eye, there is a blind spot in your eye where there is no information being given. Yet your brain covers over that blind spot by making up information from the information around it. Now, effectively, that in itself is absolutely amazing, and we never notice this or we never think about it. And this very much proves to me that what we think of as reality is not quite what it seems. And this is very much some of the arguments that Michael Talbot put forward, and it's some of the ideas that were based upon some fascinating work done by an American quantum physicist by the name of David Bohm. And David Bohm suggested that at a deeper level of reality, everything exists as a hologram. Now, as you're probably aware, if you take a holographic image and you smash it up into smaller pieces, unlike a normal image, like a jigsaw puzzle, if you break a jigsaw puzzle apart, each section of the jigsaw puzzle contains a part of the picture. A hologram doesn't work that way. If you break up a hologram effectively and you shatter a holographic image, in fact, every single bit of that image contains the whole image. Slightly degraded, but nevertheless the whole image. So what we have here is the weird concept that everything is contained within itself. Everything is, as David Bohm called it, enfolded within itself. And indeed, David Bohm suggested that this explains some of the great mysteries of modern particle physics. There's something called the Einstein-Rosen-Podolsky, the EPR thought experiment, which is suggested by Einstein and a couple of associates. And it has now been shown that every subatomic particle in the universe knows the position of every other subatomic particle. In other words, if you take two subatomic particles and you place them in close proximity, and you put them in what's called a position of superposition, and then you send those subatomic particles to the other side of the universe, if you do something with one of the particles, the other one reacts instantaneously. In other words, the information doesn't travel at the speed of light, it travels instantaneously. Now, David Bohm came up with a wonderful thought idea of how you could explain this. And if you can bear with me a second, I'll just explain this a little bit. What Bohm said was, imagine that we were in contact with an alien civilization trillions of light years away, but we found a way of communicating with them. And what we did was we had two TV cameras, one of which was being placed in front of an aquarium with a single fish in it. The other camera was at the side of the aquarium. These signals then sent off to our alien friends on two cameras, and the aliens received them on two TV sets. Now, the aliens never seen a fish before, and they're looking at two TV screens, and they see what they think is of two separate objects moving in different directions. Until one of the aliens points out, well, in fact, there's a consistency going on here, in the sense that when one of the fish moves in one direction, the other fish moves in a similar way in another direction. And it was only one of the aliens then thinks out to itself and thinks, do you know, we're just looking at one object. We're not looking at many. We're not looking at two. And this is what Bohm said reality is. In fact, there is only one electron in the universe. It's moving at infinite speed, and it is everywhere. And again, people may turn around and say, oh, this is just, it's pseudoscience. In fact, it's not pseudoscience at all. Richard Feynman was one of the world's leading particle physicists of the late 20th century. And it was Richard Feynman that first came up with this idea of the single electron idea. Indeed, I recently had a meeting with one of Britain's top particle physicists, a guy called Jeff Forshaw, Professor Jeff Forshaw, who is the youngest professor of particle physics in Britain. And indeed, he holds the chair of physics at Manchester University, where they split the atom. This guy told me over coffee, he said, of course, you know that we know that every electron knows the position of every other electron in the universe. Now, this means that reality, space, time, and everything distance between objects is an illusion, and it's created by the mind. The idea of how things know how to be what they are, and again, that sounds like an incredibly strange statement. If you actually take apart an atom, what you find is it's 99.99% empty space. As one famous scientist put it, it's like a very small fly flying in the dome of St. Peter's Cathedral. The electrons whizzing around with the nucleus in the center. And even again, when you look at the electrons themselves, and you look at the elements of the nucleus of the atom, in fact, they themselves are actually made up of effectively nothing. They're energy. They're ripples in an energy field. So, in fact, the great mystery that science has is how matter comes about, how it is that we have the perception of solidity, and indeed, even more mysteriously, why it is that quantum effects, where you have particles that can be in two places at the same time, you have particles that move backwards in time. In fact, people talk about things like a PET scanner, positron emission tomography. Positrons are, in fact, electrons traveling backwards in time. Now, these are terms that scientists use all the time, but what they never do to say to the layman is exactly what they mean when they talk about a positron. Positrons were first suggested by the English physicist Dirac back in the 1930s, and even in the 1930s, Dirac came to the conclusion that these were antiparticles. They were particles of antimatter, and antimatter travels backwards in time. The whole mystery, as we've got deeper and deeper into the building blocks of science, the building blocks of the universe that we see around us, the more mysterious it's become. Indeed, I very much think that science is very similar to what it was 110 years ago, when, there was a degree of certitude as to what we knew worked. And indeed, in about 1893, 1894, scientists had said that there was very little yet to be discovered, because they thought that except for a few more decimal points, they understood everything. And then, of course, and there were one or two things they didn't understand. They didn't understand black body radiation. They didn't understand something called the photoelectric effect. And in fact, Einstein in 1903, 1904 came along and wrote his famous first papers in which suddenly he blew everything out of the water. And of course, I think it was 1901, Max Planck came along with his ideas of quantum behavior of energy. And suddenly everything changed. But we're in the same position now. There are things that they are finding now that literally do not fit in with our present paradigm. But 95% of scientists are still stuck in the science of 110 years ago. It's very, very strange. Very, 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 very exciting times, I think. And I think that consciousness is the issue here. It's two things. It's consciousness and time. Because the only thing we know with any certitude is that we are. I know that's very Cartesian and very much taking the ideas of Descartes, but nevertheless it is very true. You know, this is the only thing we know with any power or authority is that we exist. What you're probably not aware of is that I'm dealing with how the brain processes time and how time functions. And I'm now bringing together some of the ideas, because what I'm suggesting is that spirit and matter, again, are the same thing at a deeper level of reality. We don't die because death is an illusion, and death is an illusion because time is an illusion. You die in time, but effectively time is something that is mysterious and very, very fluid. And I think the answer lies in two areas that are really intriguing me at the moment, and I'm going very much into the neurology and the neurochemistry of these things. And the first thing is a comparatively recent discovery of a form of energy known as zero-point energy, quantum vacuum energy. And this is a form of energy that seems to permeate space. It seems to be everywhere around us. Now, this energy was first suggested in 1947 by a guy called Casimir, who was a Dutch researcher at Philips. And he noticed a very peculiar effect, that if you place two metal plates inside a vacuum, the plates get pushed together, as if there's some form of energy that's actually been drawn up from the vacuum itself. Now, they've been doing some research on this, and what they found is that there is a form of energy that exists in absolute, or just above absolute zero, or 272.15 degrees Kelvin, I think it is. Now, at that level, there should be no energy at all. Energy should stop. That's the definition of absolute zero. It's when everything stops. And yet they're finding that energy is coming up from somewhere. Now, there's a form of helium, I think it's helium-3, which remains fluid even at just above absolute zero. It's pulling energy from somewhere. Now, what they believe this energy is or many people are suggesting, particularly a guy called Professor Ervin Laszlo, and Laszlo is suggesting that this energy, this zero-point energy, is what the ancient mystics and the ancient Vedas and the Buddhists and various other people call the Akashic record, or the Akashic field. It's a field of information, and it contains information about everything. So effectively, we are existing in a field of information, and we can pick up that information under certain mental circumstances when the brain or consciousness is attuned to it. And I believe the area of the brain that focuses in on this is the pineal gland in the center of the brain. Not only that, but I think the pineal gland does this by actually generating endogenous, that is, internally generated dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which some of you guys out there will be aware that DMT is probably one of the most powerful known hallucinogenic drugs known to man. In fact, there's an even stronger version called 5-MeO-DMT, which is about 6 times more powerful. Now, there is growing evidence that the human brain and the pineal gland actually excretes this stuff. And indeed, an interesting aside here is that you may or may not be aware of this, but if you take the human brain apart, and you take apart the 2 hemispheres, as you take the hemispheres apart, you will discover that everything is duplicated within the brain. There are 2 amygdalas, the 2 hippocampi, and everything else. But the only part of the brain that is not duplicated is the pineal gland. Not only that, but the pineal gland sits outside something called the blood-brain barrier. So it's effectively in the brain, but not part of the brain. Now, this tiny object it uses a considerable amount of energy, and it's a mystery because neurologists don't know why. They don't know really what its function is. The only function they've discovered so far is the generation of a substance called melatonin, which is the substance that makes you go to sleep at night. But there is also evidence that it can generate dimethyltryptamine. Now, again, if there's anybody out there who has been involved in deep meditation, this may ring a bell to you. But at the 49th day of gestation, the embryo in the womb, the pineal gland is at the back of the throat. And after the 49th day of gestation, the pineal gland moves from the back of the throat into the center of the brain. However, in doing so, it leaves a very, very tiny duct. Now, I've spoken to many people about this that do deep meditation, and many people have told me that when they go into deep altered states of consciousness and very deep meditation, they have a very, very unpleasant taste in the back of their throat. The Tibetan Buddhists, the Dream Yoga Buddhists, call this the nectar of transcendence. I believe this is the dimethyltryptamine dripping down the back of the throat and being tasted in the back of the throat because it's excreting it. Now, if this is the case, this would explain out-of-the-body experiences. It would explain near-death experiences. It would explain lucid dreaming. It would explain many, many altered states of consciousness. Because if you read the books by individuals such as James Orrick and people like Rick Strassman and various other individuals who have been in, Graham Hancock is another individual in question, who have been taking a drink that people take down in Latin America called ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is effectively a liquid form of dimethyltryptamine. The shamans have been taking this drink for millennia. And what do the shamans do? They go into altered states of consciousness. They go into near-death experience type scenarios. There's the effect of the tunnel. They go down a tunnel. They see lights around them. When they get to the other side of the tunnel, they meet beings of light. They interface with these beings of light. These beings of light tell them things. But what is even freakier is that one of the consistent ayahuasca visions and dimethyltryptamine visions is twin snakes. And the snakes talk to people. The snakes curl around each other. It's DNA. It's the DNA talking to us. DNA communicates with us. In fact, it's quite strange again as to, and many, many other researchers have been interested as to how the shamans in Latin America make ayahuasca, because ayahuasca is quite strange. It's a drink that is made of two different plants. There's something called Banisteriopsis capi, and there's another thing called Psychotropia, I think it's called. And one is a leaf, and one is a vine, it's a bark. And what they do is they take the two together and they boil them overnight, and they reduce it down, and they end up with this most disgusting liquid that people drink. In fact, one of the main dangers of when you drink ayahuasca is throwing up, because your body just really wants to get rid of it because it's so foul. But the fascinating thing is that the dimethyltryptamine is found in the leaves of the psychiatric plant. The DMT is in that plant. But if you just ate that plant or made a drink out of that plant and drank it, it would have no effect. Because there's something called, there's an inhibitor in the stomach that nullifies the effects. It's called the MAO, monoamine oxidase. And what it does is, it effectively makes the DMT ineffective in the stomach. It's an enzyme that reacts with it. However, there is another enzyme in the Banisterius plant, the Banisterius capi plant, that effectively nullifies the effect of the MAO in the stomach. Now, the question is, there are around about 80,000 different plants in the Amazon. How did supposedly primitive people find the two plants they needed to put them together in the right way to make one nullify the other, to make a very, very highly powerfully hallucinogenic drug. Now, the interesting thing is they were asked, and the shamans gave an answer. They said the plants told us. In other words, because shamans don't necessarily need to take ayahuasca to go into higher states of consciousness. And if we have time, I'll explain why this is, because many of them experience something called temporal lobe epilepsy, which actually can access higher states of consciousness automatically. Because if you read the literature on temporal lobe epilepsy, you'll find that this is the case. And many people who have temporal lobe epilepsy have what's called Gershwin-Waxman syndrome, which is hyper-religiosity. But I'll come back to that later. And it's actually focused on the temporal lobes, not the frontal lobes. It's temporal lobe epilepsy. And the temporal lobes are the ones around the ears. Now, the temporal lobes are quite an intriguing part of the brain anyway, and for a long time they've been considered that's where the seat of the soul is. Now, temporal lobe epilepsy is quite different to other forms of epilepsy in the sense that normally it manifests itself as something called petit mal absences. In other words, if the seizure remains in the temporal lobes, the person does not lose consciousness. In fact, somebody only has a grand mal seizure when the electrical storm goes across the corpus callosum from one side of the brain to the other, causing unconsciousness. But as long as it's just localized in one part of the brain, you don't become unconscious. Now, people who have temporal lobe epilepsy will have what's called absences. They'll stare at you for a few seconds, and then they'll come back. While they're away, they can be away for hours. But effectively, when they have these absences, they go into a very, very strange place. Historically, the amount of individuals in history, particularly religious leaders and individuals like that, who clearly had temporal lobe epilepsy, is quite uncanny. And what I suggest is that shamans are normally selected because they have elements of TLE. I mean, there was a guy called Ozzy Temkin that wrote an amazing book called The Falling Sickness. And of course, the falling sickness is what epilepsy was known historically to be. It was also called the diviner's disease because people who have epilepsy, particularly temporal lobe epilepsy, show abilities of precognition. They seem to be able to see the future. And that, again, has been known historically. But shamans themselves do not need drugs like ayahuasca to go into shamanic states. They can do it automatically. And when the shamans down in Peru and Brasilia and the Amazonian rainforests went into these trances, this is where they encountered the plants and where the plants told them what plants to use in order to create ayahuasca. Now, again, Jeremy Narby argues this, as does Graham Hancock, that this is DNA communicating to us. Now, it gives off a particular form of light called biophotons. And light is one of the things that people claim when they have DMT experiences and everything else. It's light that is the major thing they see. And I think there is a link because I'm pulling together the neurology, the neurochemistry, the quantum physics into a huge grand theory of everything. Although I hate to use the term theory because it is speculation moving into a hypothesis at the moment. It's not a theory because it hasn't been tested scientifically. But I am working with people to see if we can test a lot of these things scientifically. But suffice to say, all this is linking together to tell us that reality is far more exciting than the modern scientific paradigm tells us. But what I'm not doing is throwing modern science out. I'm not one of these people that said that modern science has no answers. It has the answers, it's just looking in the wrong places. It's not pulling the bits and pieces together. And indeed, people turn around to me and say, well, what qualifies you pulling all these things together? You know, because by background, I'm a social scientist. But my argument is, what qualifies anybody? You know, you'd have to be a qualified neurologist, neurochemist, particle physicist, sociologist, theologian, many areas that you need to have a knowledge of in order to pull this together. That's not being vain. I just think I'm very fortunate in the things I've been interested in all my life. But it does seem to work. It does seem to work. And this is where the Daemon Eidolon comes in, because people who have an experienced temporal lobe epilepsy, many of them claim that they experience another mind in their head, another entity that shares their life with them. And this entity knows their future. Many of you out there will have probably heard the stories of Socrates. And Socrates used to stop in the street and stare into space, clearly petty malabsences. But he also said that he had a being that shared his life, which ironically enough he called his Daemon. And the Daemon used to even tell him whether it was going to rain the next day. Now, this intrigued me as to how this being that is part of us seems to know the future. Now, I'll guarantee there's an awful lot of you guys out there will recognize this sensation. You're about to do something. You're about to make a big decision. Something inside you tells you not to do it. You have this feeling that it is wrong, or indeed that it is right. I argue that that sensation you have is your Daemon. There will be many of you out there who will have had precognitive dreams. Even more strangely, there'll be many of you that will have had feelings and sensations that something dangerous is going to happen, and you actively avoid the circumstance, therefore avoiding whatever danger you had before. In my book, The Daemon, I received a letter from a guy who was down in then Rhodesia in 1969, in a place called Mount Darwin in the north of Rhodesia. And he was at the top of an armoured vehicle. He was a soldier. And as he came round a corner, a voice in his head shouted, "Ambush, ambush, ambush." He didn't react. He was then physically pushed out of the seat at the top of the armoured vehicle into the camouflage in the side. And as he did so, machine gun fired and hit the seat. The three bullets hit the seat he'd have been sitting on. He'd have been killed instantly. Something saved his life. Indeed, this being was then so manifest in his life, he told me he was working in a factory in North America, in Minnesota, and he was walking across the factory floor carrying a cup of coffee. And as he did so, his left hand came up over the cup of coffee, just as a blob of oil hit the top of his hand. That's how effective the Daemon can be. The question is, how does the Daemon know the future? And I suggest that the Daemon knows the future because it's lived your life before. It's the part of you that has lived your life before. Do you ever get deja vu sensations? I'll give you a little bit of neurological background to this first. If you read most books on neurology and you read most books on psychology, they will give you something called the visual pathways theory of deja vu. The visual pathways theory was suggested first in around 1962 by a guy called Robert Electron. And what the visual pathways is that, as you probably may or may not be aware, the two hemispheres of the brain effectively work independently. Now, in order for each side of the brain to have stereoscopic vision, the periphery, the right and left fields of each eye, if I'm making sense, filter in to each side of the brain. So each side of the brain has stereoscopic vision. Now, what Ephron suggested was that there can be a circumstance whereby your non-dominant hemisphere, ordinarily your right hemisphere, processes a visual signal a split second before your dominant hemisphere does. And when it does so, the signal then crosses the corpus callosum, which is the muscle that attaches, or the fibre of nerves that attaches the two sides of the brain together. It crosses the corpus callosum and arrives at your dominant hemisphere at the same time or slightly after your dominant hemisphere sees the image. So you get this feeling of seeing something twice or recognizing something. So it's a kind of recognition, but you don't know where you've recognized it from. Now, this hypothesis, this theory, was proven very popular, and the amount of times it's been cited to me as being an explanation. However, 3 or 4 years ago, a researcher called Dr. Akira O'Connor at Leeds University, who's working with a guy called Chris Moulon, who's got a research unit on deja vu at Leeds University, They found people who'd been born blind, who had profound déjà vu sensations, or technically déjà senti. Now, the visual pathways leading from the eye to the brain go in a totally different route to the ears. So therefore, an aural, a hearing déjà sensation, if you get them, proves that the visual pathways theory is incorrect. Now, what I suggest is happening is much more simple. I believe that déjà vu is exactly what it feels like. You have lived this moment before. You may or may not be aware, I keep saying this all the time, don't I, that around about 30% of people never experience a déjà vu in their lives. 70% of people have them regularly. Some people have precognitive déjà vu sensations, whereby they know what's going to happen next. Most of us, including myself, only have déjà vu sensations where you have this vague recognition. Now, what I suggest is actually happening is that, and this is where my whole cheating the Ferryman hypothesis comes in. Imagine a scenario that you're about to die. You're in a car crash. The car's about to crash. As the car hits the other car, for argument's sake, let's assume it's an impact. You hit a wall. It's easy if you hit a wall. Your car's about to hit a wall. As you start to approach the wall, something starts to happen very strangely in the brain. Now, neurologists know that at points of stress, there is a neurotransmitter in the brain called glutamate. And glutamate floods the brain during times of stress. And one of the things that they know glutamate does is slows down your perception of time. This is why when you have a shock or you're involved in an accident, you have this sensation of time slowing down. It's a virtual universal phenomenon. And that's the glutamate in the brain. Now, in times of great stress, like when you're about to die, the glutamate hits the brain massively. And what does glutamate do? It slows down your perception of time. So suddenly, as you start to approach the wall, you start to slow down. So suddenly what would normally be a split second suddenly becomes hours or weeks or years or a lifetime. And that final second, something very strange happens in the brain. The brain then draws up the records, either from the Akashic record, whereby the brain itself records your whole life. And I have got evidence from neurological experiments done by a guy called Wilder Penfield in the 1940s and 1950s, whereby he showed that the human brain remembers everything and he could actually recreate three-dimensional past life memories by just stimulating the exposed brain of conscious patients, but that's an aside now. So these past life memories start to run through your life. In fact, you're catapulted back to the moment of your birth, and you start to relive your life again. Now, I'm a professional member of the International Association of Near-Death Studies, and one of the famed moody traits that people use to gauge a near-death experience is the phenomenon called a panoramic life review, where people have near-death experiences and they say, my life flashed before my eyes. That's in a near-death experience. In a real death experience, which I'm talking about now, it doesn't flash. In other words, imagine a scenario in a near-death experience whereby your whole life the recording of your life is started holographically, and then something realizes you're not going to die, presses the fast forward button, because it runs through super quickly. But in a real death experience, it doesn't run super quickly. You're in it. It's like the Matrix. It's like the Matrix movies. You're suddenly in this three-dimensional, brain-created, or Akashic field, or zero-point field, or information-created recreation of your life that is so real you cannot tell that it's an illusion. Just like Robert Anderson in The Matrix, Neo. He doesn't know until he has the encounter with Morpheus and co. that he's living in a dream sequence. Similar situation for David Ames in the movie Vanilla Sky, the Tom Cruise character. Another film that actually deals with this in great detail is Jacob's Ladder. All these movies deal with a theme that is a universal. It's called the eternal recurrence and the eternal return. That we go back and we live our lives again and again and again. Now, imagine you're living your life for the second time, but this time there's part of you that remembers that you've lived this life before. It's seen the movie. It knows what's going to happen. It's like your co-pilot. It's like you're driving a car. You're the driver, but you have a passenger who can't drive the car, but knows what's going to happen. So this passenger warns you through dreams, warns you through hunches, feelings, inklings, voices sometimes, because it knows what's going to happen. Now, this is where it gets intriguing, because if it warns you to not do something and you do not do that something, you've changed the future, haven't you? Because if you're watching a movie, you can never change a movie because once the movie's recorded, you can watch it again and again and again, and even if you know what happens, you can't change it. I suggest that you can change it because of something known as the ever many worlds interpretation of particle physics, is that many particle physicists believe that the only way they can explain certain observed phenomena of subatomic particles is that the universe splits into millions of copies of itself every second. Now, if it does that, it means there are millions of us having this conversation now, and each conversation will be slightly different. And each one of those will be downloaded onto the Akashic record, the Akashic field, the 0 point field. It's like a huge computer program. It's like a huge virtual reality first-person computer game, like Lara Croft or Tomb Raider. And every single event in your life is encoded into the 0 point field that can be drawn up through the microtubules of your brain to recreate holographically a version of your life. Okay? This means that when you make a change, your life changes. This time round, you don't die. This time round, you don't get in the car and you don't crash. This time round, my friend in Rhodesia wasn't shot. His Daemon pushed him away and he lives another life. And at the end of that next life, you then live another life again and again and again and again. One of the things that up until recently I haven't gone into what I would call the teleological question, the idea of, is there a purpose to all this? Is there a background to it? But as I've developed, my own position has changed in the sense that I'm taking a far more spiritual, possibly viewpoint. And what I'm coming to the conclusion now is, and it's only my opinion, I have no scientific proof for this, but it seems to make sense to me. And the analogy I use is the movie Groundhog Day. Again, as an interesting aside, Danny Rubin, who was the writer of Groundhog Day, in Groundhog Day, it's quite interesting. Phil Connors, the weatherman, goes to Punxsutawney to see Punxsutawney Phil come out. It's the 2nd of February, I never remember, 2nd or 3rd of February. And he lives that same day over and over again. Knows the future of his own day. Okay, it's like a unified being. Now, what I think happens is that we live our lives over and over and over again, but just like Connors does in the movie, we start to become a better human being by learning by our mistakes and learning about the pain we give to other people by our omissions, by our nastiness, by our selfishness. We eventually live the perfect life. Now, this goes to the root of religions like Buddhism, and the idea that by doing this you become an avatar. You become a being that has lived a perfect life, and you can then choose to move on to the next level. And I think you become a being of light. And I think light is, it was fascinating you were talking about the sun. Everything is light. We are bottled light. Matter is bottled light. The neurons in our body, the energy in our body, it's all light. We are made of starlight. So effectively, light is our natural place. We are beings of light, but we need to evolve. It is, again, in Gnosticism, you may be aware of the the Persian Gnostic teacher Mani, who formed a religion called Manichaeism. And in that, and most Gnostics will always argue that we are trapped in the body. We are trapped in matter. Matter is evil. Wrong term to call it evil, but matter is an anathema to us. It's the creation of the demiurge, Yaldabaoth. It's something we're trapped within. But our true light is within us, and I believe the true light within us is our own. Because when we live each life, the Eidolon forgets, but the doesn't. It's the that evolves. And it evolves to a point where it moves on, becomes a light being, and then it moves on to whatever the next stage is. Now, what is it? Remember, in terms of cheating the ferryman, you have to take into account that this is all happening in a tiny sliver of time just before you die. In other words, you are living outside of time when you're existing in this illusionary world. I call it the Bohmian IMAX. There's lots of terms I use. Over the years, the terms have become part of even the whole idea and the philosophy behind this is called Italian philosophy. And in Italian philosophy, this is what it's all about, is the moving on, the way in which the Donnet helps you develop. The Bohmian IMAX is the illusion we live within. And I call it the Bohmian IMAX, ironically enough. It's a kickback on something called the Cartesian theatre, which was first suggested by a American philosopher called Daniel Dennett in his book Consciousness Explained. And what Dennett suggests is that, and this always amazes me, Daniel Dennett and other eliminative materialists such as Daniel Dennett, the Churchlands and various other individuals do not believe we have an inner life. We are fooling ourselves into thinking we are conscious. Who Daniel Dennett thinks wrote the book, I've no idea. But effectively, this is what eliminative materialists think, and this is the ultimate level of materialism. We're fooling ourselves. We're not conscious. I don't have an inner life. You don't have an inner life. They're not really there. They think they're there, but they're not, which is clearly self-evident nonsense. It's empirically proven to be wrong, because, of course, the word empirical comes from the Latin for experience. And the one thing I experience is I think, therefore I am. It's very Cartesian. And this is what he's being dismissive by calling it the Cartesian theatre. It's the idea that inside your head is a little man, and he's taking all your senses in. And inside his head is another little man and another little man, which is, of course, an infinite regress. But, of course, that's so simplistic, because if the brain works on holographic principles, it's everywhere. And, in fact, I believe that the brain is a hologram and the universe is a hologram, and it's an embedded hologram. In other words, everything is a hologram, and this is why I call myself a non-dualist, because everything is this huge hologram. I also believe, or I'm coming to believe, that the hologram itself is what we would call God. You know, it's something that Bill Hicks said once, you know, the idea of we are all the same being, perceiving ourselves as individuals. It's like our own soap opera. You know, and this is very much what a lot of people like Benedict Spinoza said, and lots of other philosophers have said this. It's panpsychism. It's the idea that God is within us. All the religions state this. Look within to find God. It's because we are God. God is everything. God is the hologram. God is DNA. It's all an amazingly huge, entwined brilliance that is the universe. And it's suddenly, you know, I get to my great age now of 58 years of age and realize all my life, because I've been very much an atheist and an agnostic, and I've been missing the point. I've completely missed the point by being a materialist. I haven't actually thought out of the box. Awful term. But there is a spiritual belief that we can have that doesn't mean that you have to reject science. You just have to look at science in a different way and look at the universe in a different way. I think that the Gnostic texts are powerful beyond powerful. And I have been intrigued by Gnosticism because I went back to the original, the Nag Hammadi texts, the Hymn of the Pearl, and the other apocryphal Gospels. And it is clear to me that these guys were explaining something symbolically but real. Now, to me, the whole concept of the demiurge and the archons seem to me to be real. There do seem to be antagonists that seem to be getting in the way of us thinking in certain ways. And of course, there is the old philosophical idea that in order to have light, you've got to have darkness. You have to have a contrast, to have a balance. Now, and I know this it's probably going to sound crazy, but the amount of times I have had problems over recent years has been phenomenal. It's become a joke. In fact, in my peak experience, we actually call it the Archon Effect. We wait for the Archons to attack. We made the whole of Skype Australia collapse, go down, about 2 years ago when I was interviewing a guy called Robert Bruce, who's an astral traveller. Brilliant guy. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a great fan of his work, and he's a great fan of mine. And again, if you read his work, you can see how where I'm coming from may not necessarily mirror image what he's saying, but it does. In other words, when you astral travel, as far as I'm concerned, you're traveling in alternate universes and alternate dimensions. You're not in this world. You're not in this place. You're another part of the matrix that looks like this. But that's an aside, really. But in terms of the whole idea of how the Gnostic texts work, I'm totally on board with them. Indeed, one of the things I was immediately reminded of Philip K. Dick and the way in which he writes about Gnosticism in most of his books. And the way Gnosticism is riven through things like the Matrix. It's a religion that is about to have its time, because I believe that if you look at the Gnostic elements of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and you look at Sufism, you look at the Kabbalah, and you look at the Christian Gnostics, it's wisdom within wisdom. Now, I genuinely believe that when the Cathari were massacred in 1254, whenever it was, at Montségur, during the Albigensian heresy, I believe that the secret that they died for, people turn around and say it was the Holy Grail. It wasn't. I think the secret they died for was the thing I'm talking about, this human duality, this Daemon Eidolon thing. Because if you start reading the Gnostic texts after you've read, and it strikes you, it leaps out at you, how what I'm saying and what they've been saying is a mirror image. I find it uncanny how powerful. The Hymn of the Pearl. But the Hymn of the Pearl, you read the symbolism in that. A young man leaves, and he leaves his twin behind. It clearly is symbolic of. And of course, the Gnostics have long believed that we are dual beings. We have this shard of the pleroma inside us. We have this shard of light that's trapped within the body, that's trying to get out. The Eidolon is the creation of Yaldabaoth, whereas part of the light, it's part of Sophia, it's part of the greater something, and we return back to that. In fact, the Romans had a slightly different term. They called it the genius. Most religions believe you have this higher spirit, this something that's given to you at birth. And on top of that, it's a virtual universal. I mean, I was surprised that even the Hawaiian Islands, which are technically one of the most isolated places on the planet, their Huna religion has exactly the same structure that I suggest in terms of the higher self and the lower self. And they argue again that the higher self guides you. Now, there is an awful lot of reports in America about angels and everything else. Now, and that gets poo-pooed, by rationalists and everything else. They say this is silly and it's stupidity. No, it's not. What it is, it's a manifestation of itself in whichever way the person who's receiving the message, the Eidolon, will feel at ease with. For example, classic example of this, near-death experience, the being of light that people experience. If you look at the descriptions of the being of light, you can have your grandmother, you can have a religious figure, you can have Elvis Presley. Young children have their pets. They have school friends and school teachers who are still alive. So clearly, whatever the being of light is, it's not what it presents itself as being. In other words, it is something that is disguising itself to make you feel at ease. So if it wants to look like an angel with wings, it will look like an angel with wings. If it wants to look like a little fluffy animal, it'll look like a fluffy animal. But the downside of this, and this again intrigues me, is that there is the negative elements of this. what I call the kakodemon, Greek kakos, evil, as opposed to the kalodemon, which is the good ones. I'm more and more getting intrigued by the work of Dr. Rick Strassman on DMT, dimethyltryptamine, and the way in which he did a series of experiments with volunteers at the University of New Mexico in the early 1990s. And a lot of people, when they have DMT encounters, encounter beings. They encounter greys. They encounter what Terence McKenna called the machine elves. Now, these beings do seem to have ulterior motives, and they do seem to be intelligent. These beings are also encountered by people when they lucid dream. If you read the books of Robert Wagner, and you read the work of Tom Campbell, when you read Robert Monroe, when you read Robert Bruce, all these people who astral traveled, distance view and everything, always say that you will encounter entities that will be antithetical towards you. Now, I'm intrigued by this because if you look back through history, and it's not me being original here, there's many books that have been written on this, but if you read books like Passport to Magonia by Jacques Vallée, or you read Project Trojan Horse by John Keel, all these books take the alien abduction scenario through history. And it's consistent. The elves, the kobolds, the furry folk, the Tir de Danann, all these symbols, these beings that people encounter, they're the modern day greys. And it's what are they? Do they manifest? They seem to definitely manifest when you take DMT. Now, is it, again, that they are intradimensional beings that are part of something? Are they part of the Archons? Are they here to stop us going forward? I don't really know. This is all supposition, but it all fits into the greater ITLAD concept, really. And again, I'm delighted here. I'm getting a lot out of this because it's making me think, which is great. David Icke is somebody that, when he goes on about, the reptiles and things, I have a little bit of a problem with. But a lot of the other stuff he says, mirrors my own in many, many ways. In fact, David contacted me comparatively recently, wanting to meet up sometime. But we like to see the world the way we see it, and it could be that we're building these things into something they're not. Now, I've never encountered anything like this, but then again, I'm somebody that's never had really any what I would call really weird experiences. I've had lots of odd experiences since and indeed, I described the experience I had with a machine called the Lucid Light device in Switzerland 2 years ago. And I believe that you can encounter other things. Whether it's part of your own mind or not, I don't know. But the Gnostics did talk about these things. And again, we do have the issue that, the consistencies you have in every civilization. You have the concept of leaving the body, out of the body experiences. You have the concept of the religion. And you also have the concept of the little people, or the beings, the other beings. So clearly, we can't just ignore these things because they're clearly archetypes. They're Jungian archetypes, but just because it's a Jungian archetype doesn't mean it's not real. It's interesting in that, as a historian and a social scientist, I particularly specialised in millenarian religions and sort of end of the world cults and everything else when I was at university. And every generation feels that theirs is the generation that is at the end times, that things are going to change. There's going to be a huge change, a huge sea change in the way humanity is. However, there does seem to me to be at the moment, and I don't know whether it's purely and simply because of the world I am now in, but it seems to me that humanity seems to be splitting into two groups. There seems to be the groups that really don't want to know. They really don't want to move from the security they have of this nice, solid, Newtonian world where everything makes sense, everything's in its place, and everything else. Whereas there's some of us that are pushing the envelope open and are saying humanity has to change. We can't go on like this. We can't go on being divisive as we are. We can't go on having our silly little beliefs and killing people who don't have the same belief. We're destroying the environment. Our economies are shot. Clearly, we are in terminally bad times at the moment, but there is this shining light. There is this kind of wanting something better and looking inside to find answers. And I think the answers are there. Now, again, it was something I was thinking about recently, and again, it's hypothesis, it's only supposition. Just imagine that there is a huge cataclysm that's about to happen, and there's going to be a nuclear war, or there's going to be some kind of massive problem with the planet or something else. And everybody dies within a few weeks of each other. Okay. Now, if that happened, we'll know that we've only got 2-3 years or whatever to live. Now, if that was the case, I would imagine that the collective humanity would start to try and manifest themselves, to try and collectively stop the disaster that happened last time. Now, for instance, might be able to save me from being in a car crash, but it can't save me if there's a nuclear war. The only way I can do that is working with others collectively to have a political opinion, a groundswell, a movement, or something that will actually change the events before they happen as they did last time round. Now, again, this is pure supposition, and I've got no reason or no hard, fast rules, but it makes sense to me. The one consistent thing, anybody who predicts the end of the world, the one thing that's consistent is they're never right. But nevertheless, there does seem to be, we are in dangerous times at the moment, and we do have the power to destroy ourselves, and there's so many different ways. There was a series of books called the Riverworld Trilogy. It was ended up with 4 books by Philip Jose Farmer, written the late 70s, early 80s. And in that, it had a similar kind of suggestion. And indeed, the Robert Sawyer book, Fast Forward, which was made into a TV series 2 years ago, that has, again, a similar concept. The idea that something happens and everybody gets affected in the same way. And I'm just wondering whether the reason, because I'm amazed, for instance, and I sit back and I think, how the hell did this happen? And the thousands and thousands of people now that have contacted me from across the world and going, that makes sense to me. And I think, weird. Because this is never what I intended, but I'm driven. And I say to people, and I'll say to the people now out there, the people, this isn't me anymore. This doesn't belong to me anymore. This whole Lit Lad thing, I'm just a normal guy. But this movement has got, it's incredible how big it's becoming. And day on day, it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm delighted it is, but I don't know why. And I'm like everybody else going, where are we going to end up with this? Where's it going? And I don't know, but all the time new ideas are coming out. People are starting to write books based upon my ideas and hypotheses. Somebody's just about to bring out a movie based upon it. We've got people doing music albums based upon it. People doing artwork on it. It is a phenomenon. And it's just wonderful to be part of all this. Okay, well, one of the things that I'm really, really fascinated on at the moment and building on is a model of reality. I've discussed about DMT, I've discussed about DNA, but there are other areas that really intrigue me as well as to how the human brain may be able to interface at a deeper level with this 0 point field, this 0 point energy. And I'm building up a model at the moment, which I'd just like to talk through. You may or may not be aware, but within the neurons of the brain are very, very small structures called microtubules. And these are very, very small structures of protein. And in fact, they are so small that quantum events can affect them. Now, they are made like bands. They look a little bit like DNA strands. And they give off what's called single photon coherent light from each side. And each of them bring about interference patterns, electromagnetic interference patterns within them. Now, A couple of researchers, a guy called Stuart Hammerhoff, who's a professor of anesthesiology at the University of Arizona, and Professor Roger Penrose, who's the Rouse Ball Professor of Mathematics at the University of Cambridge over here in the UK, have come together with a model using microtubules that they called ORC-R, which is orchestrated reduction. Now, this model is really quite intriguing, because what they're saying is that quantum events can affect the microtubules and actually can bring about consciousness, and that consciousness is created by quantum events. But I'm taking this one step further, because I think that the structures within the microtubules and the DNA within the microtubules actually can communicate using this a little-known substance called Bose-Einstein condensates. And Bose-Einstein condensates are subatomic particles that are all acting as one. A group of electrons or photons or whatever that act as a single entity. And an example of a Bose-Einstein condensate is a laser beam. Now, I believe that Bose-Einstein condensates can draw up information from the zero-point field. But I also believe that something else could be happening here. There are other structures within the brain called micro black holes, which was something suggested by Stephen Hawking. And Stephen Hawking suggests that space is just full of trillions and trillions of black holes, including your brain and the space within your brain. Now, if, as you know, a black hole sucks things into it, now imagine that consciousness could be sucked into a black hole within the brain, going through something called an Einstein-Rosen bridge, and come out in another universe. Is that where we go when we take DMT? Is that where we go when we astral travel? And is that where we go when we lucid dream? That's the last thing I'm going with. So hope that it's intrigued people and given them some food for thought. And check these things up.